"Sir, step away from the property. You're trespassing." That was the first thing I heard, as red and blue lights painted the ranch gates like some kind of suburban crime scene. My jaw hung open, suitcase still heavy in my grip, dust from the gravel driveway swirling into my face. Karen, my HOA president, self-appointed sheriff of this cul-de-sac empire, stood center stage, clutching her leather-bound HOA handbook as though it were scripture. She jabbed her finger toward me, lips painted in a shade that could stop traffic, shrieking, "He doesn't belong here. He's violating HOA territory." I wanted to laugh, but the sight of strangers parked in sleek SUVs at the end of my driveway killed any trace of humor. Their engines idled, tinted windows cracked just enough for me to see clipboards, flyers, and the unmistakable look of people scoping out a deal. An auction on my land. My neighbors peeked from behind their blinds, little rectangles of pale faces glowing under porch lights, the whispers practically buzzing in the humid air. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, agitated, like even it couldn't believe the nerve of this circus. I set the suitcase down in the gravel and raised both hands, half in surrender, half to keep myself from strangling the HOA president in broad daylight. "Officer," I said carefully, "this is my ranch, my home. My name is on the deed." The cop looked between me and Karen, pen hovering over his little notepad, brows knitted as though he was trying to do algebra in his head. So," he said slowly, "are you saying you live here?" Karen cut in before I could breathe. "He used to, but he abandoned this property. Bylaw 14C states that if a homeowner neglects community obligations for more than 30 days, the HOA can repossess, maintain, and auction the property to protect neighborhood value. He's squatting." The officer blinked at her like she'd just spoken in a foreign language. "Repossess," he repeated, rolling the word around like it was gum he didn't want to chew. Karen pressed forward, robe cinched tight at her waist even though it was the middle of the day. "This man hasn't been to a meeting in 6 months, hasn't paid dues, hasn't responded to notices. We warned him. We voted. The property is now under the HOA's jurisdiction. He has no right to be here." Now, to be fair, there had been letters, thin envelopes tucked into my rusty mailbox, all stamped with the HOA's sterile return address. I remembered tossing them onto the counter, unopened, because Karen's demands always included something ridiculous: repainting the barn doors to a community-approved taupe, trimming the hedges along the private road, even replacing my perfectly fine mailbox because it didn't reflect neighborhood standards. I'd been out of town for months on family business, and sure, I'd missed a meeting or 5, but abandoning my home, that was a stretch even for Karen logic. "I've got the deed in my truck," I told the officer, pointing behind me. "Title, mortgage, taxes, all paid. This land belongs to me." Karen let out a scoff that could peel paint. "He's manipulating you. Do you know how many times we've had to clean up his weeds? How many complaints we've fielded from neighbors about the state of his fences? He's neglected this ranch, and the HOA doesn't tolerate neglect." She waved her binder at the SUVs like she was auctioning off cattle. "We have buyers ready, willing, and able to restore this land to its full potential." I followed her gaze. Sure enough, one of the SUV windows slid down and a man in a polo shirt lifted a brochure with my house on the cover. A glossy flyer. Karen had printed and distributed marketing materials for my property like it was up for grabs on Zillow. My stomach dropped. "Ma'am," the officer finally said, shifting his weight, "I don't think an HOA can actually auction someone's property without a court order." Karen's lips pinched so tight they nearly disappeared. "This is private community governance. You wouldn't understand." That was Karen's favorite move, make it sound too complicated, too official, so that people gave up questioning her. And, to be honest, it usually worked. Most neighbors didn't want to tangle with her over bylaws and special assessments. They'd just nod, sign the check, and move on. But I wasn't most neighbors. "Tell you what," I said, taking a step closer, gravel crunching under my boots. "Why don't we walk inside my house, officer? You'll see my furniture, my bills on the counter, my dog's leashes hanging by the door. Then you tell me if it looks like I abandoned anything." Karen's hand shot out, barring my way like she was Gandalf at the bridge. "You cannot enter until this matter is settled in the next HOA meeting. It's trespassing. It's harassment. It's—" "Karen," I said, finally letting a bitter laugh slip, "you're not auctioning my ranch. Not today." The officer cleared his throat, clearly wishing he'd pulled traffic duty instead. "Look," he said, "I'm going to have to call this in. Maybe get the sheriff out here. This is above my pay grade." Karen's eyes flared, the red-blue lights catching in her pupils, turning them into molten glass. She whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "You should have stayed gone." And that's when I noticed movement at the end of the driveway. One of the SUV doors opened, and the man with the glossy flyer stepped out, phone in hand, camera already recording. He smiled like he'd just stumbled onto the best reality show in town. The gavel, the flyers, the staged bidders. This wasn't just some HOA stunt. This was theater. Karen had planned every inch of this spectacle, and she wasn't about to let me ruin her performance. The officer's radio crackled. Backup was on the way. Neighbors crept farther onto their porches, emboldened by the show. And me? I was standing there, suitcase at my feet, realizing that the real battle for my ranch was only beginning. Because Karen wasn't bluffing. She was building an empire, and I had just walked straight back into the middle of it. Sold pending HOA approval. That was the first thing I heard as Karen slammed a wooden gavel against a plastic folding table in the middle of the cul-de-sac. The sound cracked through the late afternoon air like thunder, bouncing off stucco walls and rattling down the quiet street. Neighbors gasped, papers rustled, and a man in a golf visor raised his clipboard as though he'd just secured my barn in a bidding war. My barn. The barn my grandfather built with his own calloused hands, now being hawked off like a lawnmower at a garage sale. Karen stood tall behind her makeshift podium, robe cinched tight, hair bun gleaming with the kind of hairspray that could double as lacquer. Her eyes glittered with triumph as she pointed toward my property, announcing features like a real estate agent on a sugar high. 2 acres of prime ranch land, she boomed, a fully fenced corral, and barn space with endless potential. Her voice rose and fell theatrically, every phrase punctuated by the gavel striking plastic. The bidders clapped politely, sipping lemonade out of HOA-branded paper cups. I stepped out of the shadows of my porch, heart pounding, palms damp. "Karen," I said, loud enough for the block to hear, "you can't auction what doesn't belong to you." Heads swiveled, clipboard stilled mid-note. A child's juice box slurped too loud in the silence. And then, like she'd been waiting for this very line, Karen threw her hands up and declared, "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse this disruption. What you see before you is an individual attempting to interfere with official HOA proceedings. Bylaw 9AB strictly forbids harassment of board-sanctioned activities." The crowd murmured, not out of shock but curiosity. They wanted drama, and Karen was serving it with garnish. Let me pause here, because this wasn't the first time Karen had pulled a stunt. She had a long history of turning routine neighborhood concerns into power plays. Last summer, she fined the Johnsons for hanging a wind chime that disturbed the peace. The year before, she circulated a petition to ban lawn flamingos, claiming they lowered property values. And now, she'd taken that same energy and directed it squarely at me. My absence these last few months had given her room to maneuver, and she'd crafted this auction as both punishment and performance. I walked toward the table, gravel crunching beneath my boots, and grabbed one of the glossy flyers. My own house smiled up at me in perfect lighting, the barn outlined with cheerful bullet points, rustic charm, expandable for guest quarters, HOA-approved vision plan pending. My stomach turned. "Is this a joke?" I asked, waving the flyer at her. "You printed brochures for my property?" Karen leaned into the microphone clipped to her folding table, her lips curling into a smile that was more shark than neighbor. "Correction. Brochures for the community's property. You see, when a homeowner neglects their dues, the HOA has a fiduciary duty to preserve neighborhood standards. This auction ensures the ranch doesn't become a blight on our beloved subdivision. Someone in the crowd raised a hand timidly. But, don't you need a bank or court to do that? Karen didn't miss a beat. We have a resolution from last month's emergency meeting. Page 3 of the minutes, notarized and signed. The authority rests with the board until further notice. She slapped her binder down on the table for emphasis, papers fluttering like confetti. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. You and I both know that resolution wouldn't hold up outside this cul-de-sac. You're bluffing. Her eyes narrowed. Maybe, but perception is everything. Right now, they believe me. The bidders shifted uncomfortably, flipping through their packets. A woman in heels whispered to her husband, "Did you check the comps? This is way under market." Another man jotted something down, dollar signs in his eyes. That's when I made my move. I grabbed the microphone. "Attention, everyone," I said, voice steady, though my pulse hammered in my ears. "This auction is fraudulent. My name is still on the deed. My mortgage is current, my taxes are paid. Anyone who buys today will be buying a lawsuit, not a ranch." The lemonade drinkers froze mid-sip. Even the officer from yesterday, parked discreetly at the curb, leaned forward in his cruiser, scribbling notes. Karen lunged for the mic, but I held it high, forcing her to strain on tiptoes like a furious ballerina. She hissed into the crowd, "This is intimidation. He's trying to derail our lawful process." I turned to the bidders, my voice dropping low, persuasive. "Ask yourselves, why would she want to sell off a neighbor's property without involving a bank or a judge or anyone outside her little binder club? Why here, in the cul-de-sac, with lemonade and clipboards instead of a courthouse? Because it's theater, smoke and mirrors. She wants you to believe she's untouchable." For the first time, I saw doubt flicker across the crowd. Clipboards lowered. Whispering spread like wildfire. The woman in heels nudged her husband toward the car. Karen's cheeks flushed crimson, her composure cracking like glass under pressure. She slammed the gavel again, the sound desperate this time. "Order! The auction is still in session. Don't be swayed by his lies." But her voice wavered. And everyone noticed. Mini-climax. The illusion was breaking. I set the mic down gently on the table and met her eyes. "This isn't your empire, Karen. Not yet." The moment hung thick in the air. Then, as if on cue, the projector she'd set up on a portable stand flickered to life behind her. A laptop screen glowed, accidentally connected to the wrong folder. And what filled the sheet she'd pinned up as a makeshift screen wasn't a slideshow of property photos. It was a string of emails. Karen's emails. The crowd gasped, and I realized the real auction hadn't even started yet. "Karen, why does the HOA budget include a payment to yourself?" The words dropped into the hushed clubhouse like a brick through glass. Heads snapped toward the screen, eyes widening as the neat rows of Karen's emails scrolled larger than life on the projector. The emails weren't about landscaping or pool repairs. They were about consulting services, invoices written by Karen, billed to Karen, and deposited into Karen's personal account. The room went still, the only sound the faint hum of the old ceiling fan and the frantic clicking of Karen's laptop as she tried to shut it down. I sat back in my folding chair, arms crossed, fighting the urge to grin. For months, Karen had wielded her binder and bylaws like weapons, but now the receipts literally were glowing on a bedsheet pinned to the clubhouse wall. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, lemonade cups forgotten on the long tables lined with store-bought cookies. It smelled faintly of burnt coffee and panic. Karen recovered quickly, or at least tried to. She slammed the laptop shut with enough force to rattle the table. "That," she declared, voice slicing the silence, "is a gross invasion of privacy. These are preliminary drafts, taken completely out of context. But the damage was done." The projector, still connected, continued to display line after line of payments. $2,500, $3,800, even a $7,200 transfer labeled HOA Consulting Personal Services Rendered. The whispers started as a ripple and then spread like wildfire. "Consulting fees?" Mrs. Delgado muttered 2 rows ahead of me. "Since when does the HOA pay its own president extra?" "I thought she was a volunteer," another voice chimed in. "She fined me $200 for leaving my trash can out overnight, and meanwhile—" The noise built, voices overlapping until Karen banged her gavel on the table, the cheap wood handle cracking slightly from overuse. "Order! This meeting will come to order." It was supposed to be the monthly budget review. Normally, these meetings were dry affairs filled with line items about pool chemicals and sidewalk maintenance. People showed up because they didn't want to be fined later for failure to participate. Karen thrived in that boredom, using it as cover to pass her resolutions. But tonight, thanks to the projector's betrayal, the script had flipped. "Let me be perfectly clear," Karen said, her voice tight but steady. "These invoices were reimbursement for professional services. I've spent countless hours handling legal matters, drafting policies, consulting with outside vendors. Do you think that labor should come for free?" She tried to stare down the crowd, but the tide was turning. I caught the eye of Mr. Patel, usually one of Karen's staunchest defenders. He adjusted his glasses, frowned, and leaned forward. "Karen," he said slowly, "these emails don't show reimbursements. They show contracts, and they're signed by you, to yourself." A hush fell again, the kind of silence that lets you hear your own pulse in your ears. Karen's smile cracked. "I assure you, everything has been documented in the minutes." And that's when I spoke up. "Funny you mention minutes," I said, pulling a crumpled copy from my bag, "because I have the last 3 months' worth, and there's no mention of these payments. Not a vote, not a motion, nothing." All eyes swung back to me. Karen's glare could have burned a hole through drywall, but I kept going. "So, either the entire community has developed sudden amnesia, or you've been running a side hustle on HOA dues." Gasps erupted. A few people even stood, waving their copies of past agendas. The illusion of her control was unraveling. Mini climax? Karen, the queen of the cul-de-sac, was finally cornered. Her voice dropped lower, tighter, a hiss masked as calm. "You don't understand the complexities of HOA governance. Everything I've done has been to preserve the value of our community. Without my leadership, this neighborhood would collapse under negligence." "Or maybe," I said, leaning forward, "without your leadership it might finally breathe again." The room buzzed louder, support shifting, old allies inching toward rebellion. But Karen wasn't finished. She raised her chin, eyes flashing. "If anyone here believes these accusations," she snapped, "then I propose an emergency vote, right now. Decide whether you trust your president or the words of someone who abandoned his property and is now trying to destroy us from within." The challenge hung in the air, thick and dangerous. Neighbors exchanged glances, torn between loyalty and suspicion. The gavel shook in Karen's hand, but she held it high like a queen daring her court to dethrone her. I could feel the tension coiling tighter, like a rope about to snap. This was no longer about my ranch. It was about Karen's empire, her grip on power, and whether anyone was brave enough to cut her loose. And just as Mr. Patel stood to speak, just as it looked like someone might finally call for her resignation, the projector flickered again. Another email popped up. This one wasn't about consulting. It was about the auction. Attached was a spreadsheet of bidders' names, dollar amounts, and a note at the bottom. Projected profit split. KS personal share. The clubhouse erupted, and Karen's face went white. "Do you want the next chapter to explode straight into the fallout of that email, like a courtroom-style HOA showdown, or take a quieter, suspenseful turn where Karen scrambles behind the scenes to regain control?"